The sky above Dome 17 was an endless sheet of gray, its once clear protective barrier now dulled by decades of industrial grime. Beneath it, the city hummed with life, or rather, survival. People bustled through the narrow corridors of the megastructures, their faces pale and drawn, illuminated by the flickering glow of holographic advertisements that promised escape through pills, virtual realities, or overpriced luxuries. Dr. Woe, Jax Monroe moved among them like a shadow, his tall, wiry frame hunched slightly, his sharp blue eyes darting between the faceless crowds. Jax had learned early on that blending in was the key to staying out of trouble. Trouble was plentiful in Dome 17, where corporate enforcers patrolled the streets in gleaming exosuits, their visors glowing with an eerie red hue that promised swift punishment for anyone daring to challenge the system. Jax, however, had little interest in rebellion. His focus was singular: science. At 36, Jax had built a reputation as one of the Dome's most brilliant physicists, though his quiet demeanor and reclusive habits kept him out of the spotlight. His colleagues saw him as a loner, a man too engrossed in his work to bother with social niceties. In truth, Jax preferred it that way. The loss of his parents and younger sister during a toxic storm 20 years ago had left a void he didn't know how to fill, so he poured himself into his research, searching for answers to questions that plagued him. Why had humanity failed? Could it have been prevented? And most importantly, was it too late to fix it? Jax's lab was located in the lower levels of the Dome, a sprawling subterranean complex filled with equipment salvaged from the old world. Here, he worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of forgotten technology in the hopes of finding a way to undo the mistakes of the past. It was during one of these late-night sessions that he made his first discovery: an ancient vault buried beneath the Dome, its entrance hidden behind layers of rusted metal and forgotten wiring. The vault was unlike anything Jax had seen before. Its walls were engraved with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly when he touched them, and at its center stood a device that defied explanation. It was spherical, about the size of a large watermelon, and covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the lab. Jax's heart raced as he studied it, his mind already racing with possibilities. Could this be the breakthrough he'd been searching for? His excitement was tempered by caution. The device was ancient, clearly predating the domed cities by centuries. It might not even be functional, but as Jax ran his fingers over its surface, he felt a faint vibration, as if the device were alive. He spent weeks studying it, carefully dismantling and reassembling its components, until he uncovered its purpose. It was a time travel device, powered by a mysterious energy source he couldn't yet identify. It wasn't long before word of Jax's discovery reached Magnus Varrick. The overlord of Dome 17 was a man of immense power, both feared and loathed by the people he ruled. Magnus had built his empire on the ruins of the old world, using his wealth and influence to control the domes and the dwindling resources they relied on. To him, the time travel device was more than just a relic. It was a weapon, a means to reshape history in his favor. Jax knew he had to act quickly. If Magnus got his hands on the device, it would spell disaster for what little remained of humanity. But Jax wasn't a fighter. He was a scientist, a thinker, a man who preferred to solve problems with logic rather than violence. That was where Elara came in. Elara was a scavenger, a rogue who roamed the toxic wastelands outside the domes in search of ancient technology. She was everything Jax wasn't: bold, brash, and unafraid to take risks. The two had crossed paths before, though their encounters were always brief and tinged with mutual distrust. Elara had little patience for Jax's cautious nature, and Jax found her reckless behavior exasperating. But when she showed up at his lab one evening, a cocky grin on her face and a satchel full of rare components slung over her shoulder, Jax knew he needed her help. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Doc," Elara said, her voice teasing as she leaned against the doorway. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy braid, and her tattered leather jacket was smeared with dirt and grease. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was a spark in her green eyes that made it impossible to look away. Jax frowned, glancing at the satchel. "I take it you didn't come here to chat." "Not unless you want to," Elara replied with a wink. But I heard you found something interesting, something that might be worth my time. Jax hesitated. He didn't trust Elara, not entirely, but he also knew he couldn't do this alone. It's dangerous, he said finally. If Magnus finds out, Magnus can kiss my ass. Elara, Jax cut her off, his tone sharp. I'm serious. Elara rolled her eyes. Fine, I'll behave. Now, show me what you've got. As Jax explained the device and its potential, Elara's skepticism turned to awe. She wasn't a scientist, but she had a knack for understanding how things worked, and she could see the possibilities. So, you're saying this thing could take us back? To before the domes, before the collapse? Jax nodded. If we can figure out how to power it, Elara smirked. Lucky for you, I know a thing or two about finding power sources, but I'm going to need something from you in return. What is that? He said. A promise, she said, her expression suddenly serious. If we pull this off, you take me with you. Jax stared at her, taken aback. Why? Let's just say I've got my reasons, Elara replied, her tone evasive. So, do we have a deal? Reluctantly, Jax agreed, and so began their unlikely partnership. Together, they set out to uncover the secrets of the time travel device, navigating a world of danger and deception as they raced against time to save the future. Their first challenge was securing a power source for the device. Elara's scavenging expertise came in handy almost immediately. I've got a lead, she told Jax one morning, tossing a datapad onto his cluttered workbench. The screen displayed a grainy map of the wastelands surrounding Dome 17, with a red marker blinking faintly in the center. What is it? Jax asked, scanning the map. An old research facility, Elara explained. Pre-collapse, back when people still thought they could save the planet. Rumor has it, they were working on experimental energy tech before the whole place went dark. And you think whatever's there could power this? Jax gestured to the device, which hummed faintly on his workbench like it was waiting for them to make the next move. Elara shrugged. It's a gamble, sure, but I don't see Magnus handing over any of his power cores, do you? Jax sighed. He hated the idea of venturing outside the dome. The wastelands were a death trap, a toxic expanse filled with crumbling ruins, treacherous terrain, and things that had adapted a little too well to humanity's mistakes. But he didn't have a choice. If the device could truly change the past, the risk was worth it. They left at dawn, slipping out through an old maintenance tunnel that Elara claimed no one used anymore. She led the way, her steps confident as they navigated the labyrinth of pipes and metal grates. Jax followed reluctantly, clutching a small satchel of tools and equipment. He hadn't been outside the dome since he was a child, and the memory of that toxic storm still haunted him. When they emerged into the wastelands, the air hit Jax like a physical force. Even through the rebreather Elara had given him, he could taste the metallic tang of the poisoned atmosphere. The sky was a sickly yellow, the ground cracked and barren. In the distance, the skeletal remains of a skyscraper jutted out of the earth like the bones of some long-dead beast. Elara didn't seem fazed. Stick close, she said, adjusting the strap of her rifle, and try not to step on anything that looks like it might explode. Jax frowned. Is that a common problem? She smirked. You'd be surprised. The journey to the facility took most of the day. Along the way, Jax got his first real taste of the wastelands. They encountered a pack of scavenger drones, their insect-like bodies scuttling over the remains of an old transport vehicle. Elara dispatched them with frightening efficiency, her rifle spitting bursts of plasma that turned the machines into smoldering heaps. Do you always travel this prepared? Jax asked, slightly shaken. Only when I've got something worth protecting, Elara replied, glancing back at him with a grin. Relax, Doc. I won't let anything happen to you. Probably. By the time they reached the facility, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. The building was mostly intact, its reinforced walls scarred but standing. A faded sign above the entrance read Helios Advanced Energy Research. This is it, Elara said, her voice low. Stay close. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the corridors eerily silent. Jax felt a chill run down his spine as they moved deeper into the facility, their footsteps echoing off the walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Here, Elara said, stopping in front of a heavy metal door. The control panel beside it was smashed, but she crouched down, pulling a small device from her bag. Give me a minute. As she worked, Jax's eyes wandered to the walls. They were covered in faded posters and diagrams, relics of a time when humanity still believed in progress. One poster caught his attention, a sleek-looking machine surrounded by glowing energy fields, with the words, "The future is bright," printed in bold letters beneath it. Elara's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Got it! The door hissed open, revealing a large chamber filled with machinery. At the center of the room stood a towering structure, its core glowing faintly with a blue light. Is that? Jax began. Looks like a fusion reactor, Elara said, her tone impressed. Old tech, but it might still work. As they approached the reactor, a low growl echoed through the chamber. Jax froze, his heart racing. What was that? Elara raised her rifle, her eyes scanning the shadows. Trouble. From the darkness emerged a hulking creature, its skin pale and leathery, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was a remnant of the old world, a twisted byproduct of the toxic environment, and it didn't look happy to see them. Get back! Elara shouted, firing a shot that struck the creature's shoulder. It roared, charging at them with terrifying speed. Jax stumbled backward, his mind racing. He wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't helpless either. Spotting a loose pipe on the floor, he grabbed it and swung as the creature lunged at him. The impact sent a shock through his arms, but the creature recoiled, giving Elara an opening to fire again. Keep it distracted, she yelled. Distracted? How exactly am I supposed to? Jax's words were cut off as the creature swiped at him, narrowly missing. He scrambled out of its reach, his heart pounding. Finally, Elara landed a shot to the creature's head, and it collapsed with a final guttural snarl. Jax sank to the floor, breathing heavily. That was horrifying, he managed, looking up at Elara. She smirked, offering him a hand. You did good, Doc. Not bad for a guy who probably spends most of his time in a lab. Jax took her hand reluctantly, pulling himself to his feet. Let's just get what we came for and get out of here. With the reactor secured, they began the long journey back to the dome. But as they walked, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter with the creature was just the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. The journey back to Dome 17 was tense. The reactor core they salvaged was heavy, requiring both of them to carry it on a makeshift sled Elara had thrown together from scavenged materials. The toxic wind howled around them, carrying the faint, acrid scent of decay, and Jax couldn't help but glance over his shoulder every few steps, half expecting another creature to lunge at them from the shadows. Elara, by contrast, seemed completely at ease. She hummed softly to herself as they trudged through the wasteland, occasionally shooting Jax a playful look. Relax, Doc, she said at one point. You look like you're about to have a heart attack. That's because I just fought off a mutant monster with a pipe, Jax shot back. Excuse me if I'm a little on edge. She laughed, a low, melodic sound that echoed strangely in the desolate expanse. You did all right. Not everyone's cut out for this kind of life, but you held your own. High praise from someone who does this for fun, Jax muttered, but he couldn't help the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. As they neared the dome, the familiar sight of its towering walls came into view, their surface pockmarked and corroded by centuries of exposure. The entrance they'd used earlier was still clear, and they slipped back inside without incident. Once they were safely within the dome's labyrinthine maintenance tunnels, Jax allowed himself to breathe a little easier. All right, Elara said, dropping the sled with a grunt. Now comes the fun part. Fun part? Jax asked, raising an eyebrow. Getting this thing up and running, she replied, gesturing to the reactor core. Assuming you actually know how to hook it up to that fancy gizmo of yours. Jax sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've done the calculations. Theoretically, it should work, but theoretical success and practical application are not always the same. Great, Elara said dryly. Nothing like a little uncertainty to keep things interesting. They hauled the reactor core back to Jax's lab, where the time travel device sat waiting. Its carvings glowed faintly in the dim light, as though it could sense the power source nearby. Jax set to work immediately, carefully connecting the core to the device using a series of cables and converters. Elara watched from a nearby stool, occasionally offering sarcastic commentary, but mostly staying out of his way. After hours of meticulous adjustments, Jax stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. That should do it. The device began to hum, its glow intensifying as the reactor core powered it. Elara leaned forward, her eyes wide. "It's working," she said softly. Jax nodded, his heart pounding. "Now we just need to—" The lab door slammed open, cutting him off. Standing in the doorway was a squad of corporate enforcers, their visors glowing red in the dim light. At their center was a figure Jax recognized instantly, Magnus Varrick. "Well, well," Magnus said, his voice smooth and cold. "Dr. Monroe, I had a feeling you'd be up to something interesting." Jax felt his stomach drop. "How did you find us?" Magnus smirked. "You underestimate how closely I watch my city. And you, Elara, I thought you'd have learned by now that scavenging in my territory has consequences." Alara's hand moved to her rifle, but Magnus raised a hand, and the enforcers aimed their weapons at her. "Don't," he said. "I'd hate for this to end messily." "What do you want?" Jax demanded, stepping protectively in front of the device. Magnus's eyes flicked to the glowing sphere. "That," he said simply. "You've stumbled upon something remarkable, Dr. Monroe, but you're not equipped to handle it. I, on the other hand, could use it to ensure humanity's survival. Properly managed, of course." "You mean ensuring your control," Elara spat. "This isn't about survival for you. It's about power." Magnus's smile widened. "Power is survival, my dear. Surely you've realized that by now." Jax's mind raced. He couldn't let Magnus take the device, but he was unarmed and outnumbered. Desperately, he glanced at Elara, who gave him a subtle nod, her fingers twitching toward a small, round object on her belt. "A grenade." "Fine," Jax said, stepping aside. "Take it." Magnus raised an eyebrow, clearly suspicious. "You're surprisingly cooperative." "I'm a scientist," Jax said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I know when I'm outmatched." Magnus gestured to his enforcers. "Secure the device." As the enforcers moved forward, Elara sprang into action. She lobbed the grenade toward them, and it exploded with a blinding flash, releasing a cloud of dense smoke. "Run!" she shouted, grabbing Jax's arm and dragging him toward the back of the lab. Jax stumbled after her, coughing as the smoke filled his lungs. They reached a hidden hatch in the floor, an escape route Elara had insisted on installing when they first started working together. She yanked it open, and they scrambled down into the maintenance tunnels below. Behind them, Magnus's voice echoed through the lab. "Find them, and bring me that device!" They ran for what felt like miles, the sounds of pursuit fading as they put more distance between themselves and the lab. Finally, they emerged in an abandoned sector of the dome, collapsing against the wall of a crumbling building. "Well," Elara said, panting, "that went about as well as expected." Jax groaned, rubbing his temples. "He's not going to stop. As long as he knows about the device, he'll keep coming after us." "Then we need to get out of here," Elara said. "Take the device and go somewhere he can't reach us." "Easier said than done," Jax replied. "The dome's the only place we're safe from the wastelands." "Not necessarily," Elara said, her expression thoughtful. "There's a place I know, a hidden settlement out in the wastelands. They're off the grid, completely self-sufficient." "Magnus doesn't even know they exist." Jax hesitated. The idea of leaving the dome was terrifying, but staying wasn't an option. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it, but we need to take the device with us." Elara grinned. "Now you're talking." As they began planning their escape, Jax couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time, it seemed like they had a chance, not just to survive, but to fight back, and he was determined not to waste it. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Elara insisted on traveling light, but Jax was determined to take everything he might need to repair or even rebuild the time travel device if something happened. The device itself was compact enough to fit into a reinforced case Elara had brought along, but its delicate carvings and intricate circuits made it feel far heavier than it looked. "Are you sure this hidden settlement is real?" Jax asked as he packed a toolkit. "Sure as the sun," Elara replied, tossing a few cans of nutrient paste into her bag. "Well, as sure as anything gets out here. I've been there before. Long story, but trust me, it's safe." Jax gave her a skeptical look. "How long ago was that?" "Couple of years," she admitted, pulling her braid tighter. "But they're survivors, Doc. They're still out there. Magnus has no clue they exist." "And if they aren't?" Elara flashed him her trademark grin. Then I guess we improvise. You're good at that, right? He muttered something under his breath, but her confidence was oddly reassuring. He wasn't used to relying on anyone but himself, but Elara had proven time and again that she could handle whatever the wastelands threw at her. He just hoped he wouldn't slow her down. They left the dome under cover of darkness, slipping through the same maintenance tunnel they'd used before. This time, Elara had rigged a small device to scramble the surveillance drones that patrolled the perimeter. It bought them a few precious minutes as they crossed the barren no-man's land outside the dome. Once they were deep into the wastelands, Jax felt the oppressive weight of the dome lift slightly, replaced by the equally oppressive emptiness of the open sky. The stars above were dim, barely visible through the haze of pollution, but they were there, a reminder of the world that had existed before everything fell apart. Elara led the way with a determined stride, her rifle slung across her back and her eyes scanning the horizon. Jax followed close behind, clutching the case with the time travel device like it was a lifeline. Every sound made him jump, the distant howl of the wind, the faint rustle of debris, but Elara seemed unfazed. They traveled for hours, stopping only briefly to rest and rehydrate. The terrain grew rougher as they went, the ground littered with jagged rocks and twisted remnants of metal. Jax stumbled more than once, his legs aching from the unrelenting pace. "How much farther?" he asked, panting. "Not much," Elara replied, glancing back at him. "You doing okay, Doc?" "Define okay," Jax muttered, but he kept moving. Eventually, they reached a series of rocky cliffs that loomed like silent sentinels in the darkness. Elara led Jax to a narrow crevice, almost invisible from a distance, and motioned for him to follow. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. They squeezed through the crevice and emerged into a hidden valley, shielded from view by the surrounding cliffs. The air here felt different, still toxic, but less oppressive. In the distance, Jax could make out faint lights flickering like fireflies. As they approached, the settlement came into view. It was a patchwork of salvaged materials and ingenuity, makeshift huts built from scrap metal, solar panels rigged to capture the faintest glimmers of sunlight, and gardens growing in carefully protected greenhouses. People moved quietly through the narrow paths, their faces shadowed but watchful. A man approached them, his expression wary but curious. He was older, with a wiry frame and a weathered face that spoke of years spent surviving in the wastelands. "Elara," he said, his voice gruff. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Prosody. "Good to see you too, Orin," Elara replied, flashing him a grin. "We need a place to lay low for a while. Got a situation." Orin's eyes flicked to Jax and the case he was carrying. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that could change everything," Elara said cryptically. "But we'll need your help." Orin studied them for a long moment before nodding. "Come on, then. You're lucky we're still here." They followed him into the settlement, where curious faces peeked out from behind makeshift curtains and half-assembled walls. Elara explained their predicament in hushed tones as Orin led them to a small, reinforced hut near the edge of the settlement. "This is yours for now," Orin said, opening the door. "Stay quiet, stay out of trouble, and we'll talk in the morning." "Thanks, Orin," Elara said, clapping him on the shoulder. He gave her a faint smile before disappearing into the shadows. Inside the hut, Jax set the case down carefully on a rickety table and collapsed onto the nearest chair. His whole body ached, and his mind was spinning with exhaustion and anxiety. "You okay?" Elara asked, sitting across from him. "I don't know," he admitted. "This is a lot." She leaned back, her expression softening. "Yeah, it is, but we'll figure it out, Doc. We've come this far, haven't we?" He nodded, but his thoughts were already racing. Magnus wouldn't stop looking for them, and even this hidden settlement might not be safe for long. They needed to move quickly, to figure out how to use the time travel device before it was too late. For now, though, there was nothing to do but wait. As the adrenaline wore off, Jax felt his eyelids grow heavy. He barely noticed Elara draping a blanket over him before sleep claimed him, his dreams filled with fragments of the past and whispers of a future that felt just out of reach. Jax awoke to the muted sounds of the settlement stirring. A faint hum of activity filtered through the walls of the small hut, voices murmuring, tools clinking, and the occasional bark of a scavenger dog. For a moment, he forgot where he was, the events of the previous day muddled in the haze of sleep. But the sight of the time travel device, still secure in its case on the table, brought reality crashing back. He sat up, stretching his sore limbs, and found Elara perched by the window, her rifle resting across her lap. She was watching the settlement intently, though she turned when she heard him stir. "Morning, sunshine," she said with a smirk. "Sleep well?" "As well as anyone can when they're being hunted by a corporate overlord," Jax muttered, rubbing his neck. "What's going on out there?" "Just the usual," she replied. "The folks here don't exactly roll out the red carpet for strangers, so they're keeping an eye on us." Can't blame them, really. Jax stood and moved to the window, peering out at the settlement. People bustled between the makeshift structures, their movements purposeful but wary. A few cast glances toward their hut, suspicion etched on their faces. "Do you trust them?" he asked. Elara shrugged. "As much as I trust anyone. They're survivors, same as me. They'll help us if it benefits them, but don't expect any warm fuzzies." Before Jax could respond, there was a knock at the door. Elara was on her feet in an instant, rifle in hand. "Who is it?" "It's Oren," came the gruff reply. Elara opened the door cautiously, and Oren stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his gaze flicking to Jax. "Now that you've had a night to settle, I want to know exactly what you've brought to my doorstep." Jax hesitated, glancing at Elara, who gave him a nod. "You might want to sit down," he said. Oren pulled up a chair, crossing his arms as Jax began to explain. He spoke of the time travel device, the reactor core they'd scavenged, and Magnus Varrick's relentless pursuit. Oren listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each word. "You're telling me that thing can rewrite history?" Oren asked, nodding toward the case. "It has the potential to," Jax said carefully. "But it's not that simple. The device isn't just about time. It's tied to human consciousness. I'm still working on the specifics." "And Magnus wants it to—" "What? Make himself king of the world?" "Something like that," Elara interjected. "The guy's got a god complex the size of the dome." Oren rubbed his temples, letting out a long sigh. "This is dangerous, Elara. If Magnus finds out we're harboring you two, he won't just stop at the dome. He'll send his forces here, and we don't have the firepower to stop him." "We're not asking you to fight him," Jax said quickly. "We just need a place to work. If I can figure out how to use the device, we can leave, go back and fix things before they ever got this bad." Oren's gaze was piercing. "And if you fail?" Jax hesitated. He hadn't allowed himself to consider that possibility. "Then Magnus wins," he admitted. "But if we do nothing, he wins anyway. This is our only chance." For a long moment, Oren said nothing. Then he stood, his expression grim. "You've got 1 week. After that, I want you gone, whether you've figured it out or not." Jax nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Oren said, heading for the door. "This settlement has survived because we stay under the radar. Don't bring trouble to my people, or I'll make sure you regret it." After he left, Elara let out a low whistle. "Well, that went about as well as I expected." Jax sank into a chair, running a hand through his hair. 1 week. That's not much time." "Better than no time," she said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Come on, Doc, let's get to work." The next few days were a blur of activity. Jax threw himself into studying the device, poring over every detail and running countless simulations on his portable interface. The device seemed to hum with anticipation, its intricate carvings glowing faintly whenever he touched it, as if it were alive and waiting for him to unlock its secrets. Elara, meanwhile, worked to secure the hut. She reinforced the walls, set up rudimentary alarms, and kept a constant watch for any sign of Magnus's forces. Despite her gruff demeanor, she was surprisingly resourceful, and Jax found himself increasingly grateful for her presence. One evening, as they took a break to eat, Elara leaned back in her chair, eyeing Jax thoughtfully. "So, what's the deal with this consciousness thing? You've mentioned it a couple of times, but you haven't explained it." Jax set down his ration bar, choosing his words carefully. "The device doesn't just manipulate time. It's connected to the human mind in ways we don't fully understand. It uses awareness, memories, emotions as a sort of fuel. That's why it's so powerful and so dangerous. If it's misused, it could erase entire timelines." Elara frowned. "So, what happens to us if we use it? Are we still us?" That's the part I'm trying to figure out, Jax admitted. But there's something else. I think, he hesitated, unsure how to say it. I think the device is connected to you. Elara blinked. What do you mean, connected to me? When I analyzed its energy signature, it matched something unique, something in your brainwaves. I don't know why, but the device seems to be synced to you specifically. Alara's expression was unreadable. You're saying this thing works because of me? Maybe, Jax said. Or maybe it needs you to work at all. She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Great, just what I needed, to find out I'm some kind of cosmic battery. Jax opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the alarms Elara had rigged around the hut began to blare. Elara was on her feet instantly, grabbing her rifle. We've got company. Jax felt his stomach twist as she peered out the window. Who is it? He asked, his voice tight. She cursed under her breath. Magnus Enforcers. They've found us. Jax's heart raced as he reached for the time travel device. What do we do? Elara turned to him, her expression steely. We fight. The blaring alarms echoed through the small hut as Jax scrambled to gather his tools and the time travel device. His hands shook as he sealed the device inside its reinforced case, its faint glow still visible through the seams. Outside, the distant hum of engines grew louder, accompanied by the sharp clank of metal on stone. Elara, rifle in hand, moved to the doorway, her every motion fluid and precise. She peeked outside, then ducked back in, her expression grim. They've got a recon skiff and at least half a dozen enforcers, standard gear. They'll scout first, then move in fast. Jax swallowed hard. How did they find us so quickly? Magnus must have been tracking us, she replied, her voice tight. I should have thought of that. Damn it! Orin burst into the hut then, his face a mask of anger and fear. You brought them here? He barked, his gaze darting between Jax and Elara. Do you have any idea what you've done? Orin, we can handle this, Elara said, her tone firm. Get your people out of here, find a safe spot and wait it out. And leave you two to clean up this mess? Orin spat. If they don't kill you, they'll wipe us out as punishment. They won't get the chance. Jax said suddenly, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. I can activate the device. If it works, if we succeed, this timeline, this place, won't exist anymore. None of it will. Orin's eyes narrowed. And what happens to us? I don't know, Jax admitted, but if Magnus gets his hands on the device, none of us will survive. For a moment, Orin looked like he might argue, but then he let out a harsh breath. Fine, but if you fail, don't expect us to save you. He stormed out, leaving Elara and Jax alone again. The hum of engines was closer now, the sound vibrating through the walls. Elara turned to Jax, her expression intense. Can you really get this thing running? Jax hesitated, his mind racing. I think so. The reactor core is stable and the device is synced, but I need time. How much time? 15 minutes, maybe 20. Elara nodded sharply. You'll have it. Just stay out of sight and get that thing working. Before Jax could respond, she was gone, slipping out the door and into the shadows. He stared after her for a moment, his heart pounding, then turned his focus to the device. This was it, the culmination of everything he'd worked for. If he failed now, there would be no second chance. Outside, Elara moved like a ghost, weaving between the settlement's makeshift buildings. The enforcers had disembarked from their skiff and were spreading out, their visors glowing a menacing red in the dim light. She counted 7 of them, 6-foot soldiers and 1 squad leader, his armor bulkier and bristling with weapons. Fan out, the squad leader barked, his voice amplified through his helmet. Find them. The boss wants the device intact. Elara smirked to herself, settling into position behind a pile of scrap metal. She aimed her rifle carefully, exhaling slowly before pulling the trigger. The plasma bolt hit its mark, dropping one of the enforcers before the others could react. Contact, one of them shouted, raising his weapon. They returned fire, plasma bolts scorching the ground around her as she ducked for cover. Elara moved quickly, staying low as she fired another shot, hitting a second enforcer. The remaining soldiers regrouped, advancing toward her position with practiced precision. She cursed under her breath. These weren't the usual corporate grunts. Magnus had sent his best. Inside the hut, Jax worked feverishly, his hands flying over the device's interface. The carvings glowed brighter with each adjustment, and the hum of the reactor core grew louder, filling the room with a low, resonant thrum. He could feel the device responding, almost as if it were alive, urging him forward. "Come on," he muttered, his fingers trembling. "Just a little more." A sudden crash made him look up. One of the hut's walls buckled inward, and an enforcer stepped through, his visor locking onto Jax instantly. "Don't move," the enforcer ordered, leveling his weapon. Jax froze, his mind racing. The enforcer's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could fire, the case containing the time travel device emitted a sudden burst of light. The enforcer staggered, clutching his head, and Jax seized the opportunity. Grabbing a wrench from the table, he swung it with all his strength, knocking the enforcer unconscious. He stared at the fallen soldier, his chest heaving, then turned back to the device. The glow had intensified, and the carvings were shifting, forming patterns that seemed almost purposeful. It was ready. Elara was pinned down now, her back against the rusted hull of an old transport vehicle. Plasma bolts slammed into the metal around her, sending showers of sparks into the air. She was down to her last magazine, and the enforcers were closing in. Then, without warning, a blinding light erupted from the center of the settlement. The enforcers paused, their visors flickering as the light grew brighter, enveloping everything in its path. "Elara," Jax's voice cut through the chaos. "Get to the hut, now!" She didn't hesitate, sprinting toward the light as the enforcers scrambled to regroup. When she reached the hut, Jax was waiting for her, the device glowing so brightly it was almost hard to look at. "It's ready," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "But there's something you need to know." "No time for that, Doc," Elara snapped. "Just do it." Jax hesitated, then nodded. He placed his hands on the device, and the light intensified, filling the room with a deafening hum. Elara felt a strange pull, like the ground was shifting beneath her feet, and then everything went white. When the light faded, they were no longer in the hut. The toxic air was gone, replaced by the fresh scent of grass and the sound of birdsong. Jax opened his eyes slowly, his heart racing. They were standing in the middle of a lush green field. The sky above was a brilliant blue, unmarred by pollution. In the distance, a city skyline shimmered with life, tall, gleaming buildings that spoke of a world untouched by collapse. Elara stared in disbelief, her rifle hanging limply at her side. Did it work?" Jax swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the city. "I think it did." But even as relief flooded through him, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. They'd changed the past, but had they changed it enough? And what price had they paid to get here? Elara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "So what now?" Jax met her gaze, determination hardening his features. "Now we make sure this future stays intact, no matter what." But as they started toward the city, neither of them noticed the faint shimmer of red light flickering in the distance, a reminder that Magnus's reach was not so easily escaped. The sun hung high over the field as Jax and Elara made their way toward the city. The air felt almost too pure, as though the very act of breathing might undo the fragile perfection of the place. Birds chirped overhead, and the hum of insects filled the air. Jax marveled at it all, the colors, the life. It was a world he'd only read about, a world long gone in his timeline. Elara, on the other hand, was less enchanted. She scanned their surroundings with sharp, suspicious eyes, her rifle still at the ready. "This is too quiet," she muttered. Jax glanced at her, frowning. "Quiet is good. It means we're safe." "For now," she said, her tone skeptical. "But if Magnus has already meddled with this timeline, there's no telling what's waiting for us in that city." Her words struck a chord of unease in Jax, but he pushed it aside. They had no choice but to move forward. If the city held answers, or dangers, they needed to face them head-on. As they drew closer, the city loomed larger, its gleaming towers casting long shadows over a sprawling urban landscape. The buildings looked pristine, their surfaces unmarred by the grime and decay Jax was used to. Roads crisscrossed below, alive with the flow of hovercars and pedestrians. The city buzzed with life, but something about it felt off. Jax couldn't put his finger on it, but the perfection seemed too manufactured, too controlled. Elara noticed it too. Her expression was tight, her fingers twitching near the trigger of her rifle. At the city's edge, they encountered a checkpoint. A sleek kiosk stood in the middle of the road, flanked by two humanoid androids with polished metal exteriors and glowing blue eyes. They moved with eerie precision, scanning the faces of those entering the city. "We can't just walk through that," Elara hissed, pulling Jax behind a tree. "Those things look like they could fry us in a second." Jax frowned, thinking quickly. "We'll need to blend in," he said. "Let me handle this." Before Elara could argue, Jax straightened his jacket, tucked the case with the device under his arm, and stepped toward the checkpoint. Elara followed reluctantly, her hand never leaving her rifle. The androids turned their glowing eyes toward them as they approached. One of them spoke, its voice smooth and robotic. "State your names and purpose." Jax's mind raced. He remembered the documents and historical records he'd studied back in Dome 17, fragments of a world before the collapse. Drawing on that knowledge, he said, "Dr. Jackson Monroe, this is Elara. We're here on a research exchange program." The android tilted its head slightly, as though processing the information. "Identification?" Jax hesitated for a split second, but then, to his shock, Elara stepped forward. "Right here," she said smoothly, producing a small rectangular card from her pocket. It shimmered faintly, its surface covered in complex holographic patterns. Jax stared at her, dumbfounded. "Where did you get that?" he whispered under his breath. "Don't ask," she muttered back, flashing him a quick grin. The android scanned the card, its eyes flickering briefly. Then it stepped aside. "Access granted. Welcome to Arcadia." Elara didn't wait for an invitation. She strode through the checkpoint with casual confidence, leaving Jax to scramble after her. Once they were out of earshot of the androids, he grabbed her arm. "Where did you get that card?" "Picked it up on a scavenging run a while back," she said nonchalantly. "Didn't think it'd actually work. Lucky us." Jax shook his head, but there was no time to argue. The city lay before them, its streets bustling with life. Prosody rate %. People moved with an ease that Jax found both mesmerizing and unsettling, their clothes pristine, their faces free of the wariness that had marked everyone he'd ever known. "This place doesn't feel right," Elara said, her voice low. Jax nodded. "It's like a utopia on the surface, but something's off. Look at the people. They're too perfect." As they walked, they passed a towering holographic screen displaying a charismatic man in a tailored suit. His face was familiar, his voice booming across the city. "Citizens of Arcadia," the man said, his tone warm yet commanding. "Together, we thrive. Together, we prosper. Let us celebrate another day of unity and progress." Elara stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes narrowing. "Is that Magnus?" Jax whispered, his stomach dropping. But the man on the screen didn't look exactly like the Magnus they knew. He was younger, his features smoother, his demeanor almost benevolent. "That bastard," Elara growled. "He's already been here. He's built this place, hasn't he?" Jax's mind reeled. Magnus had clearly used the time travel device before, altering history to create this version of the future. But why? And how far back had he gone? "We need to figure out how deeply he's entrenched in this timeline," Jax said. "If we can find a way to undo what he's done." "Look alive, Doc," Elara interrupted, her voice sharp. She nodded toward a group of figures moving toward them. They were dressed in sleek uniforms, their movements precise and synchronized. Enforcement agents, and their target was unmistakably Jax and Elara. Jax's pulse spiked. "We need to run." "No argument there," Elara said, already pulling him toward a side street. They darted through the crowded streets, weaving between startled pedestrians. The enforcers pursued relentlessly, their movements unnervingly efficient. Elara fired a few shots over her shoulder, but the agents dodged with inhuman agility. "This way," she shouted, leading Jax into a narrow alleyway. The walls were lined with pipes and vents, their surfaces slick with condensation. As they ran, Jax's mind raced. They needed a plan, a way to turn the tide. Then he remembered the time travel device in the case he carried. If he could access it, maybe he could use it to gain an advantage. "Elara," he called. "We need to buy a few seconds. I can activate the device." "Buy time? Sure, let me just—" She stopped abruptly, spinning to fire another volley at the pursuing agents. Her shot struck true, hitting two of them squarely in the chest, but the others kept coming. "Do it, Jax," she yelled. "I'll hold them off." Jax dropped to his knees, fumbling with the case. The device hummed to life as he connected it to his portable interface, its carvings shifting once more. He worked quickly, his hands shaking with adrenaline. "Elara," he called. "Get ready." She didn't respond. She was too busy fending off the agents. One lunged at her, and she slammed the butt of her rifle into its helmet, shattering the visor. Another grabbed her arm, but she twisted free, firing a shot point blank. "Now, Jax!" she shouted, her voice raw with effort. Jax pressed the final command, and the device released a blinding burst of light. The world seemed to ripple around them, the air growing thick and heavy. For a brief moment, everything froze. The agents, the city, even the sounds of their frantic escape. Then, in an instant, the world shifted again. When the light faded, Jax and Elara found themselves in an empty room, its walls lined with ancient, dust-covered machinery. The only light came from the faint glow of the device, which sat silent and still in Jax's hands. Elara coughed, shaking her head. "What just happened?" Jax looked around, his heart pounding. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we just stepped out of Magnus's game and into something else entirely." The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by Jax's ragged breathing and the faint hum of the time travel device as it powered down. Dust motes swirled in the pale light filtering through cracks in the walls. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of abandonment. Jax stood slowly, clutching the device, his gaze darting around the unfamiliar space. Elara leaned against a nearby console, her chest heaving. "Okay, Doc," she said, her voice sharp. "What just happened, and where the hell are we?" Jax shook his head, his thoughts racing. I don't know exactly. The device, it's not just a time travel machine. It interacts with consciousness, with reality itself. I think it shifted us, pulled us to another point in the timeline, or," he hesitated, his mind grappling with the implications. "Or another layer of it." "Another layer?" Elara snapped. "What does that even mean?" "Alternate reality," Jax said, his voice trembling. "A branch of what might have been, or could be." Elara pushed off the console, pacing the room. "Great, so we're lost in some alternate reality because your magic ball decided to play roulette with space and time. Do you even know how to get us back?" Jax hesitated, which was all the answer Elara needed. She sighed, running a hand through her braid. "Fantastic, just fantastic." Jax ignored her frustration, his attention drawn to the room itself. The machinery lining the walls was ancient, but not unfamiliar. Monitors flickered weakly, their screens displaying lines of indecipherable code. A massive console stood at the center of the room, its surface cluttered with buttons, levers, and holographic displays. "This isn't random," Jax muttered, moving toward the console. "The device brought us here for a reason." Elara frowned, crossing her arms. "Yeah? And what reason would that be?" Jax ran his fingers over the console's surface, the holographic displays flickering to life at his touch. Lines of data scrolled past, too fast for him to process. Then, a symbol appeared on one of the monitors, a symbol Jax recognized instantly, the same intricate carvings that adorned the time travel device. "This place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's connected to the device." Elara stepped closer, her expression skeptical. "Connected how?" Jax pointed to the monitor. "These carvings, they're not just decorative. They're part of a system, a language. This facility must have been where the device was created, or at least where it was studied." Alara's skepticism softened slightly as she scanned the room. "So what? We're standing in the birthplace of your fancy time gadget?" "Possibly," Jax said, his excitement growing. "If we can access the data stored here, it might tell us how the device works and how to fix the timeline." Elara gestured to the console. "Then start accessing, Doc, because I don't think we have a lot of time to play detective." Jax nodded, his fingers flying over the console's controls. The machinery groaned to life, ancient circuits sparking as long-dormant systems powered up. A holographic interface projected into the air, displaying a series of interconnected nodes. "This is incredible," Jax murmured. "It's a map of the timelines." Elara leaned closer, her brows furrowing. "A map? Of time?" "Sort of," Jax said, manipulating the interface. "These nodes represent key points in history, moments where reality can diverge. The device must use this map to navigate the flow of time." As he spoke, one of the nodes began to glow, pulsing softly. Jax tapped it, and a flood of data filled the screen. It showed an image of Arcadia, the perfect city they had just escaped from. But this version was older, less polished. The hologram displayed lines of text alongside the image, detailing the city's origins. "This is it," Jax said, his voice trembling. "This is where Magnus started." Elara squinted at the data. "You mean this timeline?" "No," Jax said, shaking his head. "The timeline he created. He went back, altered events, and built Arcadia from the ground up. This facility was his starting point." Alara's expression darkened. "So what do we do? Smash his little timeline and call it a day?" Jax hesitated. "It's not that simple. If we erase his changes, we risk destabilizing the entire timeline. We need to be precise, undo his influence without collapsing everything." Elara sighed. "Figures. Nothing's ever simple with you, is it?" Before Jax could respond, a faint sound echoed through the room, a metallic clang, distant but distinct. Alara's head snapped up, her hand moving to her rifle. "We're not alone." Jax's blood ran cold. "Magnus's people? Doubtful," she said, her voice low. "But whoever, or whatever it is, they're getting closer." The clang grew louder, accompanied by the faint whir of servos. Elara moved toward the doorway, her rifle raised, her body tense. Jax clutched the device, his mind racing. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, a voice echoed through the room, mechanical and distorted. "Unauthorized access detected. Security protocols engaged." The machinery around them sprang to life, panels sliding open to reveal sleek humanoid drones. Their metallic bodies glinted in the dim light, and their glowing eyes locked onto Jax and Elara. "Doc," Elara said, her tone calm but urgent. "Tell me you've got a plan." Jax tightened his grip on the device. "Working on it." The drones advanced, their movements smooth and deliberate. Elara fired the first shot, her plasma bolt striking one of the drones square in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall, its eyes glowing brighter as it raised an arm, a built-in weapon emerging from its wrist. Jax ducked behind the console as chaos erupted, his mind racing for a solution. The device in his hands pulsed faintly, as if urging him to act. "Elara!" he shouted over the din. "Keep them busy. I think I can use the device to disable them." "Busy is my middle name," she called back, ducking a plasma bolt and returning fire. "Just hurry up." Jax placed the device on the console, his hands trembling as he interfaced it with the holographic map. The carvings glowed brighter, and the room seemed to hum with energy. "Come on," he muttered, manipulating the interface. "Give me something." The map shifted, and a new node lit up, its glow pulsating like a heartbeat. Jax tapped it, and the drones froze mid-step, their eyes dimming. Elara lowered her rifle, breathing hard. "What just happened?" Jax stared at the device, his heart pounding. I just found a way to fight back." Elara stepped closer, a slow grin spreading across her face. "Now we're talking. So, what's the next move, Doc?" Jax met her gaze, his determination solidifying. "We're going to Arcadia's origin point, and we're going to take Magnus down before he can rewrite anything else." Without hesitation, they turned toward the next challenge, armed with a map of time itself and a resolve stronger than ever. The glow of the time travel device faded as the drones remained frozen, their mechanical frames locked in place like statues. Jax took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His hands trembled as he disengaged the device from the console, its carvings dimming slightly but still humming faintly with potential energy. Elara slung her rifle over her shoulder, stepping up beside him. "So, we've got a map of time, a magic sphere, and Magnus to deal with. Where do we start?" Jax studied the glowing node on the holographic map. The origin point. If Magnus altered history, this node marks the first divergence, the moment where everything started to shift. Elara raised an eyebrow. "And we're just going to stroll into that moment and undo all his hard work? Sounds like a piece of cake." "It won't be that simple," Jax said, already analyzing the data. "Magnus would have protected this moment. There's no telling what defenses or contingencies he's put in place. But if we don't act, this dystopia will solidify into the only reality." Elara clapped him on the back, her touch heavier than usual. "Then let's not waste time. You handle the nerdy stuff, and I'll handle the messy stuff." Jax gave her a faint smile. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Using the device to lock onto the origin point was like navigating an ocean of swirling, chaotic energy. Jax's fingers moved across the holographic interface, isolating the node and aligning the device's coordinates. The carvings glowed brighter as the device hummed. its energy filling the room with a palpable charge. Elara paced beside him, checking her gear. "Whatever's waiting for us, I hope you're ready. I'm not lugging you out of another firefight if you freeze up." "I'll try to keep up," Jax replied, his focus never leaving the interface. With a final command, the device emitted a burst of light, and the room around them seemed to dissolve. The sensation of time travel wasn't what Jax had expected. It wasn't the rushing wind or the disorienting blur he'd read about in theoretical papers. It was a feeling of being stretched thin, like his consciousness was being unraveled and woven back together. Beside him, Elara let out a sharp breath, her grip tightening on her rifle. When the light faded, they stood in a bustling laboratory filled with sleek equipment and glowing screens. The air was crisp, charged with the hum of advanced technology. Scientists in pristine lab coats moved purposefully between workstations, oblivious to the sudden appearance of Jax and Elara. "This has to be it," Jax whispered, his eyes scanning the room. "This is where Magnus began." Elara adjusted her stance, her eyes narrowing. "Which means he's here, somewhere." They moved cautiously, weaving through the lab as they tried to avoid drawing attention. Jax's gaze fell on a massive screen at the far end of the room, where a familiar figure stood. Magnus, though younger and less polished, was addressing a group of scientists, his voice carrying a confident authority. "This is our moment," Magnus declared, his tone resolute. "With this technology, we won't just change the future, we'll control it. Humanity's survival depends on decisive action, and we are the architects of that destiny." Elara muttered under her breath. "Architects of doom, more like." Jax pulled her behind a console, his mind racing. "We can't just rush in. If we confront him now, he'll shut everything down and accelerate his plans. We need a way to sabotage his operation without tipping him off." Elara smirked. "Sabotage is my specialty, Doc. Just point me at what you want broken." Jax glanced at the time travel device in his hands, an idea forming. "If we can overload their systems, we might destabilize the timeline enough to undo his changes. But it'll take precision. I need access to the main console." Elara peeked over the edge of the console they were hiding behind. "That's going to be tricky. Magnus has guards posted at the entrances, and I'm guessing this place isn't lacking in security protocols. We'll have to create a distraction," Jax said. "Something big enough to draw everyone's attention away from the console." Elara grinned, already reaching for a small explosive charge from her belt. "Say no more." Moments later, an ear-splitting explosion rocked the lab. Scientists shouted and scrambled for cover as smoke filled the air, alarms blaring throughout the facility. Magnus spun toward the commotion, barking orders at his guards. "What's going on?" he demanded. "Unknown, sir," one of the guards replied, his weapon drawn. "We're securing the perimeter." As chaos erupted, Jax slipped toward the central console, his heart pounding. Elara moved with practiced ease, picking off guards who got too close and keeping their focus away from Jax. The console was more advanced than anything Jax had ever seen, but its underlying systems were familiar enough. He connected the time travel device, its carvings glowing in response, and began feeding the system false data. The holographic map of the timeline appeared, its nodes flickering erratically as Jax worked to destabilize Magnus's alterations. "I'm in," Jax muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. "Just need a little more time." "Make it quick," Elara shouted, ducking behind a console as another wave of guards closed in. "I'm running out of cover." Jax's focus narrowed as he accessed the origin point. The data flowed like a torrent, revealing the intricate web of changes Magnus had made. Each alteration was a thread, and Jax began unraveling them one by one, his movements deliberate but frantic. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over him. He turned to see Magnus himself, his face a mask of fury. "You," Magnus snarled. "I should have known." Jax froze, his mind racing. Magnus raised a sleek weapon, but before he could fire, Elara appeared out of nowhere, tackling him to the ground. The two struggled, their movements a blur as they fought for control of the weapon. "Jax!" Elara shouted, her voice strained. "Finish it!" Jax turned back to the console, his hands trembling. With a final command, he initiated the overload sequence. The timeline map glowed brightly, its nodes collapsing into a singular point of light. The lab trembled, the air around them growing thick with energy. Magnus roared, throwing Elara off him and lunging for Jax. but the light from the device consumed them all, and everything went white. When Jax opened his eyes, he was lying in a field of tall grass, the sky above a soft, endless blue. He sat up slowly, his heart pounding as he looked around. Elara was beside him, groaning as she pushed herself upright. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "I think," Jax said, his voice trailing off as he spotted a familiar city skyline in the distance. It was Arcadia, but different. The gleaming towers were gone, replaced by a vibrant, sprawling metropolis that looked alive with hope and possibility. "It worked," Jax whispered. "We reset the timeline." Elara let out a shaky laugh, slumping back into the grass. "Remind me never to let you drag me through time again." Jax smiled faintly, but his relief was short-lived. The device, still clutched in his hand, pulsed faintly, its carvings dim but not dormant. Magnus was gone, but the timeline had shifted again, and the future was still uncertain. "What now?" Elara asked, looking at him. Jax met her gaze, determination hardening in his eyes. "Now, we make sure no one ever uses this device again." But deep down, he knew the battle for time was far from over. Jax stared at the time travel device in his hands, its faint hum vibrating through his fingertips. The carvings were dim now, almost subdued, but he could feel the energy within it, waiting, watching, alive. Beside him, Elara sat in the tall grass, her rifle resting across her knees as she surveyed the horizon. The city in the distance, Arcadia, but not Magnus's Arcadia, seemed alive in ways Jax had only dreamed of. Its buildings were less imposing, more organic, blending with the natural landscape rather than dominating it. People moved through its streets, visible even from this distance, their figures relaxed and unhurried. It was a future Jax had never known, but one he had dared to hope for. "Well," Elara said, breaking the silence, "it's pretty. I'll give you that." "It's more than pretty," Jax replied, his voice tinged with awe. "This is balance, harmony. It's what humanity was meant to build before we lost our way." Elara gave him a sidelong glance. "Don't get too comfortable. For all we know, this place has its own set of problems, and there's still the matter of that thing." She nodded toward the device. Jax tightened his grip on it. "I know, this timeline might be stable now, but as long as this device exists, it's a threat. Someone else could find it, use it, corrupt it." "Like Magnus did," Elara said, her voice hardening. "Speaking of which, he's gone, right? We didn't just shuffle him into another version of paradise, did we?" Jax shook his head. "I don't think so. The overload should have erased his influence completely. If he's still out there, he's stranded in the void between timelines, unable to interfere." "Good," Elara said, standing and dusting herself off. "Then, let's figure out how to get rid of this thing for good." The walk toward the city was surreal. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of birdsong and the rustle of leaves. Jax found himself marveling at every step, the feel of soft grass beneath his boots, the sight of a butterfly flitting past. Elara walked beside him, her movements relaxed, but her eyes constantly scanning for threats. As they approached the outskirts of the city, they passed fields of golden crops, tended by machines that moved with a gentle efficiency. A group of children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. They paused when they saw Jax and Elara, their expressions curious but unafraid. "Welcome," one of the children called, waving. "Are you travelers?" Elara exchanged a glance with Jax, her hand resting lightly on her rifle. "Something like that," she said cautiously. The child smiled. "You should visit the Nexus. It's where travelers go when they arrive. They can help you." "The Nexus?" Jax asked, intrigued. The child nodded eagerly. "It's in the city center. You can't miss it." Jax thanked the child and led Elara onward, his mind racing. The Nexus sounded like the kind of place where answers might be found, or trouble. The city was even more extraordinary up close. Its streets were lined with greenery, and the buildings seemed to breathe, their surfaces shimmering with energy. People moved with a sense of purpose, but there was no tension, no rush. It was a society built on collaboration rather than competition. Jax couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. This was the world he had wanted to create, the world he had hoped to save. But even here, the time travel device felt heavy in his hands, a reminder of the fragility of it all. The Nexus stood at the heart of the city, a towering structure of glass and light that seemed to pulse with energy. It was both awe-inspiring and intimidating, a beacon of knowledge and mystery. As Jax and Elara approached, they were greeted by a tall woman in flowing robes, her expression serene. "Welcome to the Nexus," she said, her voice melodic. "You carry an artifact of great significance." Jax's grip tightened on the device. "You know what this is?" The woman nodded. "It is the Key of Threads, a tool that weaves the fabric of time. Its power is immense, but it is not meant for mortals to wield." "Tell me something I don't know," Elara muttered, earning a faint smile from the woman. Jax stepped forward. "We need to destroy it. How do we do that?" The woman's expression grew somber. "The key cannot be destroyed in the traditional sense. It is bound to the flow of existence itself, but it can be returned to its origin, to the point where it first came into being. There, its energy will disperse and its influence will cease." "Returned to its origin?" Jax repeated, his heart sinking. "That could be anywhere, any when." The woman raised a hand, and a holographic map appeared, not unlike the one Jax had seen in the facility. She pointed to a node that glowed brighter than the others, pulsating with a deep golden light. "This is its point of origin," she said, "the convergence of all threads. But be warned, returning it will not be easy. The journey will test you in ways you cannot imagine." Elara snorted. "We've been tested plenty already. What's a few more trials?" Jax studied the map, his resolve hardening. "If it's the only way to ensure this timeline stays intact, we'll do it." The woman inclined her head. "Then I wish you luck, travelers. The fate of all realities rests in your hands." Back in the streets, Jax and Elara prepared for the next leg of their journey. The weight of the task ahead was suffocating, but neither of them spoke of it. Instead, they focused on the steps they could take now, the supplies they would need, the path they would follow. As they stood at the edge of the city, Jax glanced at Elara. "You know, you don't have to come with me." She gave him a look that could have melted steel. "Don't even start with that. I didn't come this far to let you get yourself killed, or worse. We're in this together, Doc." Jax smiled faintly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. "Together, then." Elara smirked, adjusting her rifle. "Damn right. Now let's go rewrite history again." With the device glowing faintly between them, they set off toward the unknown, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. Their mission was far from over, but for the first time, Jax felt a flicker of hope that they could truly make things right. The journey toward the origin point of the Key of Threads was unlike anything Jax or Elara had ever experienced. With the holographic map projected from the device acting as their guide, they navigated a world that was both awe-inspiring and surreal. Each step seemed to take them further from the city's calm perfection and deeper into a landscape where the laws of reality grew increasingly unstable. The first sign of this instability was the sky. What had been a serene blue began shifting, hues bleeding into one another like a living watercolor. Clouds moved erratically, twisting and turning as if unsure of their purpose. The air itself carried a faint hum, as though the world were vibrating with latent energy. "You seeing this, Doc?" Elara asked, her voice tinged with unease. Jax nodded, his gaze fixed on the holographic map. "We're approaching a nexus of converging threads. The closer we get to the origin point, the more unstable things will become." "Great," Elara muttered. As if dodging corporate goons and time drones wasn't enough, now reality itself is taking potshots at us. Jax offered her a faint smile. "Think of it as a field test for the fabric of existence." Elara snorted. "Cute. Just let me know if the sky starts falling." Their first real challenge came as they crossed a barren expanse of cracked, blackened earth. The map indicated that this was a transitional zone, a place where the threads of time were fraying. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the faint hum they'd been hearing grew louder, more insistent. Jax paused, frowning at the map. "Something's wrong." "You don't say," Elara replied, scanning the horizon. "What tipped you off? The deathly silence or the creepy buzzing?" Before Jax could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A low, guttural roar echoed across the landscape, and fissures opened in the earth, glowing with an otherworldly light. From the largest of these fissures emerged a towering, translucent figure, its form shifting and flickering like a projection struggling to stay coherent. "What the hell is that?" Elara asked, raising her rifle. "A temporal guardian," Jax said, his voice filled with both fear and awe. It's a manifestation of the timeline's defense mechanism. It's trying to protect the origin point from intruders. Well, it's doing a hell of a job looking menacing, Elara said, taking aim. Think we can reason with it? Not likely, Jax replied, clutching the device tightly. We have to get past it, but don't destroy it. If we damage the timeline's defenses, we could destabilize the threads even more. Elara gave him a sideways look. So, no killing the giant ghost monster. Got it? Anything else? Distract it while I try to access the map's override functions, Jax said, already crouching behind a jagged rock for cover. Of course, Elara muttered, rolling her eyes. The usual. The Guardian roared again, its form solidifying into a vaguely humanoid shape. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and it began to advance, each step shaking the ground. Elara opened fire, plasma bolts slicing through the air. The Guardian absorbed the energy, its form rippling but unyielding. Any time now, Doc, Elara called, dodging a swipe from the Guardian's massive arm. Jax's fingers flew over the device's interface, his mind racing. The carvings on the device glowed brighter as it responded, tapping into the surrounding threads of time. He manipulated the map, searching for a way to stabilize the Guardian and neutralize its hostility. Got it, he shouted. Keep it distracted for just a few more seconds. Take your time, Elara gritted, diving behind a boulder as the Guardian's fist smashed into the ground where she had been standing. I'm just playing tag with a freaking time god. With a final command, Jax sent a pulse of energy through the device. The Guardian froze mid-step, its translucent form flickering before dissipating into a cloud of shimmering particles. The air grew still, and the oppressive hum faded. Elara emerged from behind her cover, her rifle still at the ready. Is it gone? Jax stood, his legs shaky. Neutralized. The map redirected its parameters. It won't see us as threats anymore. Good, Elara said, brushing dirt off her jacket, because I'm not in the mood for round 2. The landscape continued to shift as they pressed on, growing increasingly surreal. They passed through forests where the trees whispered in languages neither of them recognized, crossed rivers that flowed upward into the sky, and navigated canyons that seemed to fold in on themselves, the horizon looping endlessly. Each step brought them closer to the origin point, and the device's glow grew brighter, its hum more insistent. Jax felt a strange pull, as though the device were guiding him, calling him forward. Elara noticed his change in demeanor and gave him a nudge. Don't go getting all mystical on me, Doc, she said. We need your brain, not your soul. Jax chuckled weakly. I'll try to keep it together. Finally, they reached the origin point. It was a place unlike anything Jax had ever seen, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that stretched infinitely in all directions. The ground beneath their feet was crystalline, reflecting the vortex in its surface. The air crackled with energy, and the pull of the device was almost overwhelming. This is it, Jax said, his voice barely audible over the vortex's roar. The convergence of all threads. The key of threads was born here. Elara glanced around, her grip on her rifle tightening. So what's the plan? Toss it in and hope for the best? Not quite, Jax said, stepping closer to the edge of the vortex. I have to synchronize the device with the origin point. It'll disperse its energy back into the flow of time, restoring balance. And what happens to us when that balance gets restored? Elara asked, her voice edged with concern. Jax hesitated. I don't know. Elara groaned. You're a real beacon of confidence, you know that? Before Jax could respond, the device pulsed, its glow intensifying. The carvings shifted, forming patterns Jax had never seen before. The vortex seemed to react, its swirling light growing faster, brighter. It's starting, Jax said, his voice trembling. Stay close. Elara stepped up beside him, her expression hardening. For better or worse, Doc, let's end this. Jax placed the device on the crystalline ground, and the energy within it surged outward, merging with the vortex. The ground shook, and the air filled with a deafening hum. The light enveloped them both, and for a moment, everything dissolved into pure, blinding energy. When the light faded, Jax and Elara found themselves back in the field where their journey had begun. The sky was clear, the air calm. The time travel device was gone, its energy dispersed into the flow of existence. Elara looked around, her expression wary. Did it work? Jax scanned the horizon, his chest tightening as he spotted the city in the distance. It was Arcadia, but not the dystopia they had escaped from. The towers were modest, the streets alive with real, unforced vibrancy. It worked, Jax said, a smile breaking across his face. We did it. Elara let out a shaky laugh, slinging her rifle over her shoulder. Well, Doc, looks like you saved the world. Jax nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Not just the world, all of them. As they started toward the city, the weight of their journey began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was a future they could face on their terms. Together. The city of Arcadia loomed ahead, its skyline now a harmonious blend of nature and technology. The once sterile perfection of Magnus's utopia had given way to something vibrant, alive, a world that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Jax and Elara walked in silence, the enormity of what they'd accomplished settling over them like a heavy, bittersweet fog. Jax kept glancing at the horizon, searching for any sign that the timeline might still be unstable, but everything appeared right. He couldn't help the faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. They had done it. The key of threads was gone, its power returned to the flow of time. Magnus's influence had been erased. You're grinning like you just aced an exam, Elara said, her tone teasing but soft. You good? Jax turned to her, the smile lingering. Better than good. For the first time, I think we actually made a difference. Elara smirked. You better be right, Doc. If a giant time ghost or some other weird thing pops out of nowhere, I'm blaming you. No time ghosts, Jax promised. Just this. He gestured toward the city, its streets bustling with people who seemed genuinely happy, their movements unhurried but purposeful. As they approached the outskirts, a group of children darted past, laughing and shouting as they chased each other. A woman tending a nearby garden looked up, smiled warmly, and waved. The simple, natural interactions felt almost surreal after everything they had been through. This is weird, Elara muttered, her gaze sweeping the area. I'm not used to people being nice. Jax chuckled. Maybe you'll get used to it. I wouldn't bet on it, she said, though there was no real bite in her words. As they ventured deeper into the city, Jax felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The architecture, the layout, the way people moved. It was all familiar, but subtly different. The oppressive weight of surveillance and control was gone, replaced by a sense of community and collaboration. They passed a central plaza where a holographic display projected the image of a woman speaking to a small crowd. She was addressing them about sustainable agriculture projects, her tone confident but warm. It struck Jax as the polar opposite of Magnus's authoritarian broadcasts. Guess they found someone better to run things, Elara said, nodding toward the display. Looks like it, Jax agreed. He couldn't help but wonder if this leader had come into power because of the changes they'd made, or if she had always been there, in a version of the world untainted by Magnus. They found a quiet bench near the plaza and sat down, letting the moment wash over them. Elara leaned back, crossing her legs and tapping her fingers idly on her rifle. So, she said, breaking the silence, what now, Doc? You gonna settle down in this shiny new timeline? Teach the kids how to not screw up time travel? Jax laughed, shaking his head. I don't know. Honestly, I hadn't thought that far ahead. Elara raised an eyebrow. You, the guy who plans everything down to the last decimal, didn't think ahead? I don't buy it. I guess I just wasn't sure we'd get this far, he admitted, his voice soft. And now that we're here, I don't know. Maybe it's time to let go of trying to fix everything. Elara studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Letting go, huh? That doesn't sound like you. Maybe it should, Jax said, meeting her gaze. I've spent so much of my life chasing answers, trying to control the uncontrollable. Maybe it's time I learned to just be. Elara smirked. Look at you, getting all philosophical. Next thing I know, you'll be meditating in a robe somewhere, Jax grinned. Don't count on it. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the people of Arcadia go about their lives. The weight of their journey still lingered, but it was tempered by a quiet satisfaction. They had done what they set out to do. The key was gone, and the future was safe. For now. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the city in a warm, golden glow, Elara stretched and stood. All right, Doc, let's find a place to crash. Preferably one that doesn't involve sleeping under the stars for once. Jax nodded, rising to his feet. Agreed. Let's see what this new world has to offer. They wandered through the city, eventually finding a small inn tucked away on a quiet street. The owner, a kindly old man with a weathered face, welcomed them warmly and showed them to a modest but comfortable room. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jax and Elara slept without the weight of impending disaster hanging over them. The next morning, Jax woke early, the sunlight streaming through the window casting a soft glow across the room. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and found Elara already awake, leaning against the windowsill and gazing out at the city. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. She shrugged, not turning to face him. "Got used to keeping watch, I guess. Hard to turn it off." Jax joined her at the window, the city bathed in the warm light of dawn. "It's peaceful," he said. "You should try to enjoy it." Elara glanced at him, a faint smile playing at her lips. "I'll think about it." They stood in silence for a while, the moment stretching between them. For the first time, Jax felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. And this time, they wouldn't face it alone. "Ready to see what's next?" Elara asked, her tone lighter now. Jax nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Let's find out." Together, they stepped into the new day, the world waiting before them.